Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Breakin with No Motive by Haunted Puke. Around a week ago, my roommate woke me up around 2:30 a.m., knocking frantically on my door. I immediately knew something was wrong, and my feeling was validated as soon as I walked into the living room, and 3 or 4 cops were there. Uncle Josh sidebar. While I love law enforcement, I can't think of anything more terrifying than 3 or 4 cops in your living room. My roommate proceeded to tell me that a man woke them up by turning their lights on in their room and then closed the door behind them. He then took his shoes off, put his keys on the table, and my roommate, of course, said to get the fuck out over and over again, pleading with him to leave. Told him it was not his house, but he kept saying it was his house. The guy used other excuses, such as this was the address he was given. This is Randy's house, and Randy let him in, or someone else let him in. Of course, no one did. He seemed to be high on something, but the scary thing is, neither of us heard him get in. He had taken a screen off the window and walked right on through. It was unlocked, even though we thought it was locked. We do have a bunch of trinkets on our windowsill, but nothing was broken or knocked over. And how can you be so fucked up you think someone else's house is your house, yet you're still fully in control of your bodily movements? When my roommate told him he was calling the cops, the guy simply went out to the living room, sat on the coffee table, and waited for them to come. The only experience I had seeing him was when one police officer was inside and 2 were outside holding him and talking to him. One of the officers opened a door to either get in or out, and without the slightest hesitation, this man lunged at us. His face looked extremely angry and agitated. It's like he didn't care at all that there were 3 police arresting them. He just wanted to get back inside. I could hear him screaming all the way down the stairs. What's so eerie about this is that nothing was stolen or broken. He really seemed to think that this was his house, but his story did keep changing. I got in contact with his coworker who said that he went out to the bars, but this could not just be alcohol. We also found out the guy did live in our complex, but a different building, one right next to us. Which is also scary. The police arrested him for breaking and entering and resisting arrest on a felony charge, but he was released the next day with no bond. We did sign our victim rights, but were not informed of his release. We called a bunch of places like courts and various police departments and kept getting transferred around in circles. We signed our victim statements, but we can't get a restraining order unless he breaks in again or we have another incident with him. When I spoke with his coworker again, she said they all think he was roofied, since he was out at a bar and apparently checked his bank statements and spent only $32. I don't think it was just alcohol, because he wasn't falling over or being sloppy. And again, nothing was broken, touched, or stolen. The same goes for a roofie drug. Wouldn't it make you lose control of your bodily movements, or even be unconscious and sick? When he entered my roommate's room, he just stood there on his phone. This whole thing is definitely confusing, and it sucks because we just don't know why, and probably won't ever find out why he came in. If anyone has any idea of what kind of drug this guy might have been on, let me know. But to that random man that broke in, let's not ever meet again. Sketchy Experience at a Cabin by Reddit Names Are Weird. This is one of the most creepy and traumatizing things that has ever happened to me. I was staying with my family, mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa, in an A-frame chalet-style cabin in northern Washington. Washington has a lot of forest and is densely wooded. This cabin was also on a lake, and we brought our small lake boat with us. This trip was mostly so we could try out our new boat. Everything was going well. We were having fun on the lake, hanging out with family, and just generally having a good vacation. My family decided to go to a convenience store and leave me alone at the cabin. This happened a while ago, but I was old enough to stay home alone. The nearest convenience store, though, was about 30 or 45 minutes down a dirt road. As you're expecting, this is where things started to go wrong. They left, and I'd actually volunteered to stay home because I wanted to relax and didn't want to have to get in a car. About 15 minutes after they left, it started to get dark, and I was walking around listening to music and enjoying the sunset perfectly framed over the lake. Chalets generally have pretty large windows, and this specific cabin did not have curtains. This made watching the sunset pretty enjoyable, but it didn't help things once the sun fully set. Well, Washington is known for its forests, and it's also known for Bigfoot. This story is not related to Bigfoot, as that's just a legend. I'm just pointing that out for reference. At that point, I was messing around and exploring the cabin more because the sun had now set and there really wasn't much else to do. And there really wasn't much besides a dark, kind of creepy forest and the lake outside of the window. As I was messing around, something caught my eye, and I swore I could have seen a slight movement down by the small boat dock, about 125 meters down a small, windy path. I didn't really think much of it as I was in the forest, and there are a lot of animals that could have been moving around out there. Deer, moose, whatever. At that point, I brushed it off and forgot about the movement and headed to the bathroom, which was down a hallway away from the window. While I was in the bathroom, I got this terrible feeling like something was wrong. I wanted to go check to see if there was anything inside the cabin or anything outside. And I couldn't do it right at that second because, well, I was using the bathroom. The longer I stayed in there, the worse the feeling got. Every drop of rain landing on the roof felt like the tick of a clock counting down to the end of the world. So I quickly finished up in the restroom and practically sprinted down the hall. I looked out the large set of windows and saw nothing but the lifeless forest and the moonlight reflecting off the lake. I then started to get that stereotypical feeling of being watched, and generally nothing is ever watching you. Or maybe so you think. But this time, there was something watching me. I turned around and looked down the hall at the other clear glass door at the end of the hallway. And standing on the other side of the door was a freaking deer, standing on two legs. My mind instantly screamed, "Skinwalker!" and I tried not to acknowledge it. I closed my eyes and sprinted back to the bathroom, locking myself in, as it was the only room without windows. I sat there in silence, barely breathing for what felt like 12 years, and my family finally all got back, and that's when I came out of the bathroom. Nothing was outside, and after checking the next morning, there were no signs anything had ever actually been there. You can choose whether to believe me or not, and you can choose whether to believe that this was all in my head. But, you know what, even if it was all in my head, it still was a truly scary experience. The Smiling Man in My Backyard by Cutie Pie Kitty Cat. This happened a few years back. I was home alone, or more specifically, it was just me and my dog. I was around 16 at the time, and I cherished every day that I got to spend at the house by myself. But this day, however, was different. It was a nice day outside. Sunny, warm, and not too windy, but something was off. It was around midday when I went to let my dog outside, but he refused to go. He wouldn't even go near the back door. I looked and saw nothing, so I tried to insist on him going out, but he just wouldn't. I closed the door and proceeded with my day, albeit a little freaked out. When I came downstairs again, I noticed my dog still refused to go near the back door. But at this point, he was barking and whining, like something was out there. Me, being an overly confident and somewhat stupid teenager, decided to grab the biggest kitchen knife I could find and go look outside. I expected to see nothing, and I was right. There was nothing there at all. I went back inside, closed the door, and sighed at my dog. I turned to look out the back door one last time when something walked briskly past it. I couldn't make out details. It was just a shape. But it was something. I gasped and clutched the knife tighter in my hands. I tried to assure myself it was probably just a homeless person or a neighbor looking for their dog. I stepped away from the door and gathered my thoughts and looked back outside again. This time I saw him. The man. He was standing there with this unearthly grin on his face, just smiling at me. I didn't know what to do, so I went to call my dad on my phone, but I stopped when I saw the man had a baseball bat in his hand that he had been holding behind his back, and he was shaking his head at me as if to say, "Don't do that." As soon as I took one step back, he ran at the back door and started shaking it violently and trying to turn the, thankfully, locked knob. I screamed and dialed 911. The man continued to do this, all while having this strange, calm smile on his face, staring right into my eyes. Moments later, the police arrived, and thankfully the man had done no real damage, and they arrested him. I stayed in the house talking to one of the cops while the other cop put him in the squad car. I looked out the window as he was being put in the car, and he stared right back at me like he somehow knew I was going to look out the window at him. Still smiling, and still unnaturally calm. To this day, I have no idea who this man was or why he decided to terrorize a random 16-year-old girl on a normal weekday. But, dear smiling man in my backyard, please, let's not meet again. Stalker at the Group Home by Perricelli. Back in 2018, I was 17, living in foster care. The group home was situated on a busy street. Despite living in the city, we had a backyard, a basketball court, picnic table, and at the very back, some grass. The whole backyard was surrounded by a 2-meter-tall chain-link fence, and there were houses to the right and left of ours. At the very back of the yard, on the other side of the fence, there was a public walking or biking path that stretched at least a dozen kilometers. This path would take you through this huge park along the water to the beach. It was a very popular area for people to visit. I was a regular cannabis smoker, although I was always very well put together for a teenager. The group home workers agreed to turn a blind eye on me as long as I didn't make it obvious. So on weekend mornings, I'd go for a walk to the park behind the house. I'd roll up on a park bench and smoke. One day, everything changed. It was a weekend morning as usual at 7 a.m. I made my way to my favorite park bench, and I was sitting there with my joint in my hands. It was quite windy, and it kept lighting out. Facing the water, about 100 meters of field between the waterfront and me, I noticed a man stomping through the field heading straight for me. He didn't seem like he was on a leisurely walk at all. And I remember thinking to myself, number one, why is he not using the paved path? Number two, why does it seem like he's walking straight towards me? Number three, what is he holding? And number four, is anybody else around? Panic ensued. He was holding something chunky in one of his hands. I looked around for anyone, and I noticed an elderly woman walking from the direction of the group home. She was about 20 meters away from me, and I sped walked towards the woman, but by the time I got to her, the man had made it to the bench I was sitting on. The woman kept walking towards the bench, and I went in the opposite direction. For a moment I looked back to make sure the man wasn't following me, or worse. I saw the man lay his brick down on a pile of rocks behind the bench. The woman stopped walking. I'm guessing she had processed something peculiar. Thankfully, the man kept moving straight towards the boulevard and was not to be seen in the park. The woman then turned around and looked at me with this shocked stare in her eyes. I remember feeling reassured, and we both continued on with our days without saying a single word. I'm going to jump to later that day around 9 p.m. People weren't allowed to smoke within 10 meters of any entry to an establishment, and there was only one light in the backyard of our place. It was above the entry to the establishment. So this girl in my group home went out for a smoke in the backyard, where there were no lights. 3 minutes later, she was banging on the door yelling. I let her in. She was freaking out, and we were trying to get answers out of her. She explained that there was a man. He was standing there on the path, and she watched and stared, taking pulls off her cigarette. The man then started walking towards her and started climbing the fence. That's when I shared my story from that same morning. To be honest, I thought I was being paranoid about that at first. But then when someone tried to hop the fence, yeah, I believe it was the same guy. The workers on shift that night called the police, and the police started patrolling the path at night. The group home added some garden light in the back. And I hope this piece of shit never lays hands on anyone. We Encountered Something by VJ. Back in 2014, I, a 28-year-old male, was out camping with my friends in the Amamore region of Queensland. There were Phil and Tony, my ute, and an esky full of grog and sausages. We were set for a good campout. We were driving through the forest through some of the four-wheel drive tracks and found a secluded spot by a creek to set up camp for the night. We were sitting around having a fire, having a barbie, and a couple of tinnies and sitting back having a fish. We were catching mostly dewfish, except for one fair-sized bass and a turtle. Sometime through the night, everything seemed to go silent. It was a fairly bright night, and earlier the birds were crying out, frogs were frogging, and crickets were chirping. Now, as we were all getting tired, our conversation lulled, and we noticed it. Silence, except for the fire and the sounds of the creek. It was unnerving. Phil noted that out loud, and the unease in the glances between each of us made the moment feel even more tense. It was broken when a loud splash came from up the creek, like a massive rock had been thrown into the water. We all gazed towards the sound, but nothing could be seen. We assumed it was a fish jumping in the creek, or maybe a branch falling, something like that. After a few terrifying minutes, the sounds of the animals began again, and it was as if the silence never was. We put off sleep for a while to clear the nerves, and Tony hooked something big, and we excitedly watched as his line snapped. Phil and I tried casting out, and we both caught nothing but snags. We set up swags in a triangle around the fire and decided to call it a night. Within minutes, Phil was fast asleep and snoring loudly. I was gazing up at the stars through my fly screen, just about to drift off to sleep, when I noticed that silence had returned. It was only Phil's snoring and the lapping of the water along the shallows that sounded. The fire had died down a bit by now, and the wind was still. I could hear things sporadically, leaves scuffling, twigs breaking every now and then. Isolated nature sounds amongst the silence. My heart stopped when I heard some stones on the riverbank move. When it sounded again, not once but twice, I began to hold my breath. Initially, I shook my head at myself. It was just a critter of some sort, no doubt. But the back of my mind was telling me it sounded awfully a lot like footsteps. I took shallow breaths as I waited for the sound again, but it was silent for a good minute. I had finally just begun to breathe normally when I heard the sound again, but from the other side of my swag a few meters away. I could hear sniffing, then the sound of stealthy movement as this thing creeped across the ground towards my swag. The flap was pulled down so I could see the sky and the fire. The other side was still covered. I could hear this thing breathing heavy breaths on the other side of the canvas. Then I heard the sounds of something touching the canvas itself, centimeters from my face. At the time, I assumed it was a wild dog or perhaps even a pig. Unlikely, but my head was swimming. The sniffing sounded peculiar. The nostrils sounded large, like the breathing was more hollow. I could see the canvas move in towards me as whatever it was inspected my thin cocoon. I felt trapped. The canvas was moving towards the mozzie netting, and then I saw it. Brownish, yellow, long fingers with obsidian black nails. I'm not going to lie. I screamed the loudest, highest-pitched squeal I think anyone could manage. I flipped shit. I started kicking and flailing. Tony let out a, "What the fuck?" before an even more expressive, "What the fuck?" before flipping out like I was. I heard a loud whoop whoop sound from the distance, and the thing that was above me ran away from our screams across the riverbank and loudly crashed into the water. Phil began shouting as he awoke to our panic and heard the splashing. Tony and I had already scrambled out of our swags and were legging it to the car. I could have beat Kathy Freeman that night. Phil joined us as we shouted at him to get the fuck over. He didn't need much persuasion as he looked at our belongings strewn about and our terrified faces. We got in the ute, leaving our stuff behind. My dad was pissed because it was his swag that I was using. And as I turned on the headlights, a yellowish-brown and abnormally tall shape of a person moved from behind a large tree. Phil saw what we saw this time and started going mental. I floored it through that forestry. I fucked up some panels and my suspension hated me for it, but we got the fuck out of there. Every creek crossing was terrifying. We finally got off the dirt roads and were heading back towards town. We crossed a small bridge, and from one side to the other was a trail of splashed water as if something or someone dripping wet moved from one side to the other. It could have just been water, but after what we saw, we were convinced it was the same creatures. Tony said later on that he saw the thing crouched over my swag when I screamed. He said he had his eyes closed and was listening to the sounds of a weird swirling sound in the water. He said he'd never heard footsteps, but he told me the creature had overly large eyes, was all cheekbones and head ridges. He reckoned it was an alien. I reckoned differently. That was the last time I went out camping with the boys. I later moved to the city, but whenever I go back near that area and drive over a creek or the river, I'm waiting to look down and see eyes staring up at me from the water. I don't know what that was, and I don't plan on finding out. I don't go near bodies of water anymore, and even the beach gives me the heebie-jeebies. Does anyone know what the fuck we came across that night? I haven't heard anything remotely similar to this anywhere around here. When we tell people, they think we're talking shit. We all saw something, and we agree it was human-like, but it was no person. I'll note that this creek leads into the Mary River that is home to prehistoric creatures like the lungfish. But for sure, something strange lives in those depths. Brother's Ex-Girlfriend Saved Our Lives by Finalini. This happened in 2022. To give you a bit of context, my brother and I had just moved to Los Angeles. He was 17 and I was 18. We moved to the United States without our parents, seeking a better future since we came from an unstable country. We were the only ones with papers. An acquaintance of our parents who owned some properties in the area gave us temporary housing in one of the houses he was renovating. It was in Hawthorne. My brother and I, being innocent, didn't realize that area wasn't safe. It was common to see homeless people and drug addicts, but we didn't give them much attention. I worked full-time every day to pay for rent and food, and also studied in my free time, so I didn't have much free time. My brother, on the other hand, was underage, so he couldn't do much about that. The acquaintance of our parents visited us from time to time and took us out for walks. It was tough, but at the same time he advised us a lot to face our situation in the best way possible. One night, my brother woke me up at 3 a.m., scared, saying he was hearing noises coming from the living room. I, being tired from work and also having to wake up early the next day, told him, "Don't bother me." He kept insisting until I finally heard something breaking. Immediately, I told my brother to lock the door and call the police. We were both scared, but I had to appear confident not to get him even more scared. At first we thought maybe it was Marco, the acquaintance of our parents. But that wouldn't make sense. Why would he be here at 3 a.m.? He would have told us he was coming. Then we heard footsteps approaching our room. It was a police officer. The officer asked us many questions about the place, how many rooms it had, etc. And then we saw from the window there were 6 police officers armed with assault rifles outside. The officer asked us if we had left our door open, and we told her no, and she replied, "Well, it's open now." Next thing we knew, cops were clearing all of the rooms in our place and then escorted us outside. After a while, they confirmed that no one was in our place. And after the scare, the officers asked us even more questions, and we cooperated as much as we could. I mean, we just had police in our house. Then, suddenly, we heard a woman screaming from one of the houses across the street. It was a scream like I had never heard before, one of absolute terror. The officers quickly went to check on that situation and told us to go back inside. We secured everything, and while I was talking with my brother, he told me that the reason he was awake was because that night his girlfriend had cheated on him with his best friend, and he couldn't sleep. Indirectly, thanks to her, we were able to act quickly and avoid a worse situation. Thanks to her infidelity, my brother and I are still alive. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and now I double-check if the doors and windows are locked every night. The next day, we found out that the person who had come into our place had stolen food from us, took our toaster and a laptop. Then we noticed a dirty and disgusting water bottle on the table. We knew it belonged to the intruder. To this day, we have no idea who he was or what happened to that poor lady from across the way who screamed. But seeing as there were no cops the next day and no crime scene nearby, maybe she ran across the same guy who was in our place while he was trying to get into hers. Maybe she scared the guy off, who knows? And maybe it was an unlinked situation, which kind of would be a lot more disturbing. The cops never gave us any more details and just told us to be careful. My brother and I are currently happy and a lot more safe now that the family is reunited. We use this incident as a reminder to never ever let our guards down, and we sometimes laugh about the amount of luck we had. I never thought I'd be so grateful that my brother got cheated on. Everybody, please stay safe. My Savior, Cinnamon the Pitbull, by Immediate Patient. This happened when I was back in high school. It was a Wednesday night, and usually on Wednesdays I had youth group at my church, and my mom would have date night with her mom, where they'd go play cards, watch TV together, etc. This meant we'd both be gone until 9 or 9:30 every Wednesday night. For whatever reason, both of us decided to stay home on this night. I was downstairs in my mom's room in the basement watching TV with her. We also had a roommate at this time, and Cinnamon was his dog. The roommate was out for the night. He was a night owl. So when he was gone, Cinnamon would sleep with one of us. I slept on a full-size futon frame at the time, so even though it was a tight fit for myself and a big old pit bull, I always took the opportunity to have her sleep with me. She was, and is still, a great dog. It was around 8 or 8:30. Now, remember, we usually wouldn't be home at this time, and our roommate wasn't home either. I decided to head to bed early. The way our house was set up, you'd go up a set of stairs, hit a landing, and then go up another set of stairs, and you'd be looking through the kitchen and living room. You could see the front door. So, Cinnamon and I were walking up the stairs to my room, and we hit the landing. As soon as we did, Cinnamon barked a loud bark and booked it up the other flights of stairs. I looked up and saw her booking it through the kitchen, and as I did, our front door burst open. It swung wide and hit the wall. and there I saw a man all in black, with his hood up, and he had black gloves on. He was running out of the door through our porch and entryway, down our front steps and away on the sidewalk. Cinnamon stood barking at our screen door to the porch. It was a fast, loud, and shocking event. It was winter and pitch black, so I didn't see much else because it was dark out, and everything did happen so fast. I ran over and slammed the front door shut and locked the deadbolt, and then took Cinnamon and went to my room and locked my bedroom door. I called my mom and told her what happened from upstairs, and she just told me to lock the door and stay in my room. That night I didn't sleep much. I was keeping an eye out for any noise or footsteps outside my window, and I swore I heard some things, but ultimately nothing else happened. I spent the night snuggled up to Cinnamon, thanking her for protecting me and being a scary pit bull, even though she was so gentle all the time. I'll never forget that. So, to the man who broke into my house as I was going to bed, I'm glad we never met. I Viewed the Property of a Murderer by Fox Mulder. When I finished uni, I moved back home until I found a job. As soon as I could afford to, I set up a profile on the website Spare Room. I was contacted by James, who had a room to rent on the outskirts of town that I worked in. It sounded good, but he wanted to talk on the phone before inviting me to view it. We had a chat one evening, and it turned out we had some things in common. We both enjoyed fitness, particularly swimming, and we were movie buffs. By the end of the call, it felt like I was chatting to an old friend, and I was looking forward to meeting him. James didn't specify his age, but I assumed he was in his 20s like me. When I went to view the property, he actually came out of the house next door to greet me. When he introduced himself as James, I was pretty shocked. He was at least 50, dressed quite conservatively, and looked like he was wearing a hairpiece. If he'd told me on the phone that he was in his early 20s, I wouldn't have questioned it. I went ahead with the viewing, but I'd already decided I didn't want to rent a room from him. I wanted to live with people who were a similar age to me, and I was also put off by the house decor, which looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. When I viewed the bedroom, it looked like it was occupied by a young person. There were several pairs of trainers and a game console. James said that the previous tenant, Mark, was moving to London for work. And coincidentally, my name's Mark, too. James invited me to sit in the living room after the house tour, and I didn't want to be rude, so I did. He explained that he cared for his elderly mother who lived next door. Then he started complimenting my style, saying I looked cool. He proceeded to put his hand on my leg, which made me feel very uncomfortable. When he asked if I was interested in the room, I said I had some other properties to view, but I would be in touch. I then made my excuses to leave, and everything about him screamed like a red flag. I just wanted to get out of that house. As soon as I was back in my car, I called my mom to tell her how freaked out I was, and I absolutely would not be living there. James texted me a few days later to ask if I thought any more about moving in, and I lied and said I'd found somewhere closer to town. I did eventually find something with some other young professionals, which turned out to be great. Some months later, our town was shocked by the news that a man's body had been found in the field on the outskirts of town. He was later identified as a guy named Mark. I didn't think much of it until I saw the murder suspect was his landlord, James. The same James whose house I had viewed. When I saw him on the news, I got instant chills. James was later convicted of Mark's murder. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear read on my podcast or this channel, email it to UncleJoshTrueScaryStories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't, please consider subscribing to this channel, give it a like, hit the notification bell for every time that I upload, and share it with your friends. Follow me on social media, links to that are in the description below. And if you'd like to support the channel a little more, find my link to my Patreon page and my link to my storefront at tpublic.com. Get yourself some Campfire Crew and Uncle Josh merchandise. Links to both of those are below. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.